I think it's fair to say that among present-day philosophers, Immanuel Kant is considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest, of modern philosophers. Certainly, he's had as much influence on modern thought as any other thinker, any other philosopher. In addition, Kant is one of the most important representatives of the 18th century Enlightenment period in Western philosophy and Western thought. His life spanned nearly the whole of the 18th century, from 1724, when he was born, until his death in 1804. And Kant was imbued with the ideals of the Enlightenment, the importance it placed on reason and science, on thinking for oneself, its distrust of authoritarianism and superstition, the importance of freedom and autonomy, and the dignity of the individual. All of these things meant a tremendous amount to Kant. And yet, there's a curious irony about Kant's thought. For his celebrated critique of pure reason tended to undermine many of these very ideals of the Enlightenment and its foundations, the very beliefs that he wanted to believe in. As a consequence, 20th century theologian Paul Tillich has referred to Kant as a Shiva figure of the Enlightenment. You may recall that Shiva, it was the Hindu god who was both creator and destroyer of the universe. In Hindu art and sculpture, Shiva, the many-armed one, with one leg raised, is shown dancing while one cosmic epoch comes to an end and a new cosmic epoch is created. You have probably seen this. My Shiva representation gets a little more shaky every year, as you can probably see. And so it was with Kant and the Enlightenment, Tillich says. His philosophy expressed some of its highest ideals, and yet by showing the limitations of human reason and science, that same philosophy undercut the traditional foundations of Enlightenment faith. This was Kant, the destroyer of the old intellectual order, as he had been, in a way, its completer. In this vein, the German poet Heinrich Heine said that this little man from Königsberg aroused more terror in Europe than all of the minions of terrorists like Robespierre and others, all the political villains. In this vein, Kant was also known as the Alles Zermalme, the one who crushes all. But like the Shiva figure he was, Kant also turned around and tried to reconstruct Enlightenment ideals on a new basis, some new faith that he could create. He said in a famous quote, in fact, that his whole aim was to not deny reason in order to make room for faith. This was Kant, the creator of a new intellectual order, whose work became the baseline for many of the ideas and many of the thoughts that philosophers and philosophical thought took in the later 19th and 20th centuries. In these next two lectures, we'll look at the both sides of Kant's thought. In this lecture, Kant, the completer and destroyer of modern rationality, in his great work, The Critique of Pure Reason. And this will involve us in the notion of Kant's Copernican revolution in philosophy, a term I'll explain as we go along. In the next lecture, we'll turn back to Kant's attempts to rebuild the Enlightenment faith on new foundations of practical reason, especially in the areas of ethics and values, but also in religion and politics. Now, who was this figure who had such a profound impact on modern thought? He was a little man of regular habits who scarcely ever left Königsberg in East Germany, where he was a professor. Kant grew up in a pietistic German home which emphasized a stern moral conscience and control of the passions and religious piety. His father was a harness maker, but Kant was so notoriously clumsy with his hands that he was not much of a craftsman, much to his father's distress. But he was a bright young man, so he did the next best thing. He became, if you will, a philosopher. Kant's father taught him to be industrious, to be upright, never to tell lies, a lasting influence, as we'll see. He especially recorded, that is, Kant especially recorded one incident in the life of his family. There was a serious labor dispute between the Harness Makers Guild and the Saddle Makers Guild, something a little unfamiliar to us today, but we know about labor disputes, and this was apparently a very serious one. And Kant records that throughout this terrible dispute, his parents, both of them, his mother and father, conducted themselves with and I quote, such forbearance and love and honesty to their opponents during this heated labor conflict that Kant says, the thought of it, though I was only a little boy, will never leave me. A lesson I have always thought of learning morals and learning virtue by example, which is the only really effective way ultimately to teach them. But Kant's mother was by far and away the greatest influence on his life. She had a lot of imagination and encouraged his intellectual interests, teaching him about nature and the starry heavens. Kant reflects her influence when in a famous passage of his critique of practical reason he said, "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing awe and admiration, the starry heavens above us and the moral law within us." Kant's mother died when he was only 13, undoubtedly the most profound incident in his life. I believe it had a tremendous impact on his later thought. But these two things she taught him to wonder about stayed with him throughout his life and played a huge role in his philosophy: the starry heavens above and the moral law within us. This pietistic background and belief in God and morality stayed with Kant throughout his life. But as a true representative of the Enlightenment, Kant was also convinced that religion and morality could not be based merely on external authority, as they were, of course, for his parents and for other pious believers of his time. Since we had to choose on the basis of our own reason which authority we would accept and which we would reject. Kant had in fact written a brilliant little essay called What is Enlightenment?, in which in many ways he summed up many of the ideas of the Enlightenment. And he said that the nature of enlightenment was overcoming the tutelage of childhood, in which we blindly accept authority, the authority of others, and learn to think for ourselves. Thus the motto of the Enlightenment, he said, was sapere aude, in Latin, dare to know, dare to think for yourself and reason things out in your own way. But the problem, of course, was that by Kant's time, the course of modern thought was beginning to show some cracks, if you will, in the edifice of human reason. Reason had great successes in science and in understanding the starry heavens above us, one half of his mother's story, as you recall. But it had sown confusion and skepticism when it came to questions of value and religion and ethics, the moral law within us. Kant was awakened, and he was very, very much stirred by this problem, by the way. And he was awakened to it by many of the modern thinkers who had preceded him, but especially by the Scottish philosopher David Hume, of whom you have heard, no doubt. In a famous passage, Kant said that Hume had awakened him from his, quote-unquote, dogmatic slumber. The dogmatic slumber Kant is referring to here is the naive faith of many Enlightenment thinkers that the successes of modern science, the successes of Copernicus and Galileo and Newton and all the other great thinkers who had transformed our understanding of the physical world and of nature prior to Kant's time, that these successes of science and reason would be extended beyond science to the great questions of philosophy itself, so that human reason would somehow or at some time be able to unlock the secrets of metaphysics as well as physics and of religion, as it had unlocked the secrets of the physical world. But Hume's empiricism and skepticism about the existence of God, about the nature of causation in the natural world, about the persistence of the self or the soul, all these things Hume had questioned, and with very, very powerful reasoning, Hume being another one of the greatest of modern philosophers and the most influential. All these things Hume had questioned brought home to Kant the idea that the extension of the successes of science and mathematics were not going to be easily made to the rest of the major questions of life, the questions of philosophy and of metaphysics. And Kant set out to understand why there was this sharp break between how much we could succeed in doing over here in science and how little we seem to be making advances over here in the realm of philosophy and metaphysics and other areas. And so in his great work, The Critique of Pure Reason, which was published in 1781 when Kant was quite an older a philosopher of 57 years old, in that work, Kant asked a fundamental question for the modern age. Why, he said, is modern science with mathematics so successful in giving us objective knowledge of the physical world, why we find it so hard to get such knowledge and agreement in the area of metaphysics, that which goes beyond physics, about the soul, about God, about free will and morality. And Kant's answer to his own seminal question was just as challenging to the modern world as Kant's question itself. He said, modern science and mathematics were so spectacularly successful because they deal only with the way things appear to us, not the way things really are in themselves. They deal only with what Kant called the phenomenal world, the world of appearances, whereas the big questions of metaphysics and the good concern things as they are in themselves, what Kant called the noumenal world, after the Greek word for pure reason, nous. The world studied by science, in other words, Kant is telling us, is the world that can be experienced through our senses. And in order to be able to experience that world, we impose on it, as if a kind of grid, certain forms and categories of the human mind that make experience possible. As a result, science gives us a world as it appears to us, not as it is in itself. Take space and time, for example. Is it any accident that everything science can deal with is in space and time? No, says Kant, because space and time are general forms of the human mind that make experience of the world possible in the first place. Space is not like a large box we peer into, according to Kant. It's rather a projection of our own consciousness, which makes it possible to experience objects out there in the world in the first place. And without time, there could be no experience either. After all, think about it for a moment. To experience something is to go through it, or undergo it, as we say. And there could be no such undergoing or going through something without time. Something timeless may be a thought or an idea, but it can't be an experience. So space and time, then, are two forms of the human mind that experiences must conform to just to be experiences. Kant calls them forms of intuition or forms of sensibility. We do not get the ideas of space and time from experience because we must presuppose them to have experience in the first place. This is what Kant means by calling space and time a priori forms of intuition, the Latin a priori meaning from the first or from the beginning, that we must have them, space and time, already in our mental arsenal from the beginning or from the first, a priori, in order to experience a world at all. It's as if Kant started off his gospel by saying, in the beginning were the forms of intuition and the categories of experience. That's also why, Kant reasons, we can arrive at necessary truths and proofs in mathematics and geometry, because they are about the very forms that are necessary for all of our experiences. Geometry, he thought, was about space, and that's easy enough to understand, I think. Arithmetic, more interestingly, he thought was about time, since he thought the number series began with our experience of time. 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So geometry about space, arithmetic about time. So it is then that the truths of arithmetic and Euclidean geometry were for Kant, as he called them, synthetic a priori truths. We know what a priori means. They come first and are part of the structure of our categories which we impose on the world. So they are there from the first. We don't get them from experience. What synthetic means is that they are not merely true, the truths of geometry and mathematics, that is. They are not merely true by the meanings of the words alone. They are about something real out there, something in the world. And we don't know their truth merely by just understanding the meanings of words. So they're about something real, but at the same time, they come before experience. Now, we know today, of course, that Kant was wrong about assuming Euclidean geometry, which was the only one he knew, that it was the ultimate truth about the nature of space, so that our forms of the mind were Euclidean, if you will, as he thought. And he also was wrong in thinking that Newton's physics was the last word in physical theory as well. Kant jumped the gun on these matters, to be sure. And yet, his idea of geometrical knowledge, as grounded in spatial intuition, contained a grain of truth. For even when we imagine nowadays, as we can, non-Euclidean geometries, for example, we imagine a Riemannian or a spherical geometry as if the structure of space was on the surface of a sphere rather than being flat, as in Euclidean geometry. When we imagine even a spherical geometry, or some of these other different geometries modern mathematicians have imagined, we still have to imagine it in space. We imagine that space is like a three-dimensional layer on a four-dimensional sphere. So Kant seems to be right, after all, that geometry and arithmetic and mathematics in general is based largely on spatial imagination. We've heard recently that Einstein, for example, had in his brain an extra large portion that dealt with spatial visual imagination, and apparently that had a great deal to do with his tremendous insights and abilities in this area. Now, Kant's account of space and time also provides us with the first clue to the meaning of his well-known Copernican revolution. That was Kant's own term. He used it to describe his philosophy. And the idea was that the human mind is the source of the forms of intuitions and the basic categories in terms of which we see the world. So they come from us. Rather than the world imposing them on us, those categories and forms come from us, and we impose them on the world. Its forms of intuition and categories of the mind are a priori. They come before all experience. They are not a posteriori. They do not come after or are derived from experience. This is the Copernican revolution. In effect, Kant inverted the order of knowledge as Copernicus had inverted the order of the sun and the earth in cosmology. Instead of thinking that the ideas and other forms by which we understand the world are imposed on us from the outside world as experience, we impose them on that world. And, of course, Kant was here overcoming some of the views that he had inherited of the last 2 centuries in the modern era. John Locke it was who said that that the mind is a blank slate, and the world imposes ideas and categories on it, if you will. And Kant is turning that all around as Copernicus turned it around and said, no way, it isn't from the world that we get these basic ideas. We actually impose them on the world itself. So as Copernicus had dispersed humans to the periphery of the physical universe, Kant put them back into the center as regards our knowledge of that world. Now, Kant does not make this claim only for space and time. In his critique of pure reason, he goes on to argue that there are also categories of thought that must be a priori components of our thinking and must be imposed on a world of experience. There are 12 such categories in Kant's thought, but we'll only focus or mention a few of them to illustrate what he's getting at. First of all is the idea of substance, the idea that there are persistent things in the world, like rocks and stars and trees and humans. So substance is one of Kant's categories. We see the world that way. We see persisting things. We don't see things just flicker by us. Causality is another one. The idea that some things necessarily produce other things and bring them about. Without that, how could we understand a world? Plurality is yet another one. The world contains a plurality of different kinds of objects. Fairly obvious, but a very basic category. Unity is another one, that these objects nevertheless have common traits that make it possible for us to formulate ideas and laws about them. And finally, existence. We assume that some things exist in our experience independently of that experience, that they would still be here, that the room would still be here when we left it. We assume that as a basic condition of experience, he thinks. Now, I've listed 5 categories here. Kant has others. In fact, when he came up with his list, he used, if you will, and scholars are very, therefore, critical of the rigidity of Kant's list because he came up with it in a kind of artificial way by reverting himself to the modes of Aristotelian or ancient and medieval logic to come up with these categories. So there's a bit of arbitrariness there that scholars have criticized him about. But the general idea of these categories applied to the world is a very, very important one because it does appear that we couldn't experience it at all without these categories, if you will. And the 5 that I gave you is a good example. In this respect, by the way, some of the criticisms of Kant in modern philosophy have to do just with the fact that his thought was limited by his own times. He assumed Euclidean geometry was true, he assumed Newton's physics was true, and he assumed Aristotelian and medieval logic was the end of the story as regards logic. And we know in modern times, of course, Newton's been overthrown by Einstein, and we have different geometries. And now logic in the 20th century has expanded to include all sorts of other things. It hasn't invalidated many of the forms of Aristotelian logic. It's just expanded to a whole lot of others that we might possibly have. But none of this, in a certain way, undermines Kant's Copernican revolution, because it still very well may be that these categories are needed to understand our experience, that we really could not have an experience or a significant one without substance, applying substance, causality, plurality, unity, and existence, let us say, as examples, to the world. Yet Kant is not content just to tell us what we obviously can see, that we have to apply these categories to the world. He wants to argue that we could never even experience a world at all if we didn't apply these categories. He must show that they are necessary, if you will, and that's very hard to do. In the case of space and time, I think it's fairly easy. How could we have an experience to our senses without space and without time? But with these categories, it's a little more difficult. In order to argue they're necessary, Kant comes up with a very complicated argument in his Critique of Pure Reason, which is called by a barbarous title, the transcendental deduction of the categories. This is one of those phrases Kant used to make his philosophy even more difficult than it would ordinarily be. But basically, I think we can try to understand this argument in a relatively simple way. Scholars have argued about it for centuries. It's one of those arguments in Kant that's very, very difficult, and there are different interpretations of it. But I'd like to give a clue to how it might work that will make it a little easier for you to get your mind around it, so to speak, and find out what exactly Kant is doing without getting into too much of the details. Remember, he's got to try to show us that categories like substance or persisting things and causality and plurality and other things are absolutely essential to our experience. They are absolutely necessary to it. Now, here's the clue. When Kant says these categories are necessary to experience, he means necessary to having an objective experience, not merely a subjective one. And what he almost always means by objective experience is an experience of objects out there in the world, distinct objects, if you will. Well, here's an example. Suppose somebody puts before us an array of photographs taken at a crime scene, if you will. They show in the first photograph a man approaching a building, a warehouse, let's say, with a can of gasoline. And then the next picture shows him a little closer. Then he gets to the door and he opens it. Another picture shows him inside, opening the can. Another one, he's pouring out this liquid on the floor. Another one, he lights a match, and whammo, we then begin to see pictures where the warehouse is burning and fire trucks are coming and so on and so forth. But all we have is an array of pictures here. Now, what our mind does with these pictures, of course, is it constructs a coherent story about them. In other words, it fills in the blanks. The man deliberately burned down the warehouse, we say, if we are in the courtroom wondering about the situation and are shown these pictures. But suppose someone were to say that the pictures don't tell any objective story at all. They're just a bunch of colored blotches on a series of pieces of paper or whatever. The rest is all of our imagination. We made it up, if you will. Nothing more. There was no man, no warehouse, no fire. There were just a bunch of light and dark flashes on particular pieces of paper or film. Differently colored patches, if you will, like pixels on a TV screen or a computer screen, not really representing anything, as if they had come there by more or less accident, if you will. Or like an expressionist painting created by throwing paint cans on a campus that might happen by accident to look like, say, voluminous Aunt Sally after she's had 5 cans of beer. But it's really not meant to represent anything at all, much less Aunt Sally. Well, philosophers prior to Kant, like Bishop Berkeley, had worried about this. Everything might just be an idea in our mind, wholly subjective. No objects out there in the world, really. But Kant thinks he has an answer to this crazy worry. You know, the 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein said, in order to solve the problems of philosophy, you have to learn to think even more crazily than the philosophers do. And I think that is indeed true. And that's what Kant does here. His point is this. If our minds did not impose the categories of substance and causality, unity, plurality, and existence on these pictures, there wouldn't be a coherent story to tell about the warehouse fire or anything else in the world. In other words, the categories are necessary for there to be an objective experience. We have to impose them on the story in order to get a coherent story of things. We have to say, hey, that's a man, and he actually continuously walked towards that warehouse, and it was the same man inside, after all, that had been outside. That's substance. That's a persistent thing, if you will. Then there's causality. He had to put the gasoline on the floor, and the lighting of that match actually started the fire. And so on. So to tell a coherent story, we have to start using these categories of substance and causality and so on, and we have to suppose that there's an independent reality there with a coherence to it and not just a bunch of blicks and pixels that mean nothing at all. That's the essence, I think, of Kant's transcendental deduction. That's what he's trying to do with it, trying to show that in order to have an objective experience at all, we have to impose these categories in order to tell a story. Now, you might say, well, it still might be a subjective story that we're telling, if you will, because after all, maybe the story we're telling with our categories is idiosyncratic. Maybe it's just our story, and maybe somebody else would tell a different story. Then there would be no objective world out there that we were talking about. But Kant says, no, that would be true if the categories or forms of intuition that we imposed on the world were different for each person, if they were idiosyncratic. But that's where Kant's view comes in. He thinks these forms or categories of space and time, substance and causality and the rest are universal. We all have them. And they're the same in all of us. So the story we tell, if we get it right, if you will, should be the same. That's why there's an objective world. That your story of this fire and mine either is wrong or else we're going to tell the same story. That's what objectivity really means. And without that, there would be no story at all without the categories. And that's the idea behind his deduction. All right. Well, we're now in a position, I think, to return to the seminal question with which Kant began the critique of pure reason. How is it that science and mathematics are so successful in giving us objective knowledge of the world while we can't get a similar objective knowledge and agreement about matters of philosophy or metaphysics concerning God, the soul, freedom, and values? The answer is that science and mathematics stay within the bounds of our own experience, which are defined by the forms of space and time and the categories of understanding. Mathematics, therefore, can arrive at necessary conclusions because it's about these necessary forms, space and time, of our understanding. And science deals with the interactions and laws governed by the behavior of things, causality, substance, and so on. But these very strengths of science and mathematics are the sources of its limitations. They give us only the world as we experience it through our senses, not as it really is. And yet, now, so in a way, we have Kant undermining the very faith of the Enlightenment here, in also, on the one hand, saying science and mathematics will do the job, otherwise saying there's a problem. Yet Kant felt we also have a deep feeling in ourselves to know things beyond the mere physical world. We have a metaphysical urge. We want to know about free will and God and the self and so on. And so in the last part of the critique, he raises the question about the limitations of our knowledge in these regards. And he talks about metaphysics. We desire to know beyond physics, but he says we have limitations. We can't. For example, about the soul and its supposed immortality, he says. We have experience and consciousness of our continuing self, but science can't prove there's a soul. It's beyond our experience here. So if anything, we would have to, if you will, have faith in it and believe that it exists. But science can never prove it, and no one ever can prove it. Remember the idea of making room, limiting reason to make room for faith. In addition, he says, when we try to think about the cosmos metaphysically, we run into antinomies or contradictions as to what it is. Did it have a beginning in time? You could have a proof that it did. Did it not have a beginning of time? You could have a proof that it didn't. These antinomies show the limitations of our reason in understanding these things. And also free will. that goes beyond our experience, even though our inner consciousness tells us that we, in fact, have it. And God, well, Kant showed there were limitations in trying to prove God exists. If we had to believe God exists, we would have to assume it by practical reason, but science couldn't tell us, if you will. So there is Kant talking about the limitations of knowledge. And here he is as the, if you will, destroyer of Enlightenment faith. We're going to see in the next lecture, however, that Kant turns around and tries to say something positive about these great ideas of ethics and values and free will and God and the soul. He thinks we can access them in another way through practical reason. Let's see how he does that in the next lecture.